A terrified girl rushes out of her house, calming her concerned neighbors by insisting everything is fine. She gets into her car and drives to the beach, where she tearfully calls her father, apologizing for her actions and telling her parents how much she loves them. By morning, her lifeless body is discovered on the shore. A while later, high school senior Jay Height lounges in her parents' pool. Her sister Kelly calls out, inviting her to watch a movie with their friends Paul and Yara, who frequently hang out since their mom is usually self-absorbed. Jay, however, mentions she has a date with her new boyfriend, and Kelly wishes her a great time. Later, Jay slips into a fancy dress, applies her makeup, and heads out to meet her date. Hugh, a young man, suggests going to the movies, and Jay agrees. While waiting at the ticket counter, she suggests they play a guessing game she and her sister came up with. The game is simple. Look around and pick someone you'd want to be. The other person has to guess who you chose and explain why they think you'd want to be that person. Hugh agrees, and Jay starts looking for the person he envies. Unable to guess, Hugh reveals he picked a child, saying they're completely carefree, even if they wet their pants. Jay laughs at his choice, then takes her turn, scanning the crowd before declaring she's ready. Hugh scans the room and guesses Jay picked the girl in the yellow dress, even pointing to where she's sitting, but Jay sees no one there. Assuming he's teasing, she looks over again at the empty seats. Hugh suddenly gets uneasy and urges Jay to leave with him. Puzzled, she follows him to a cafe where they spend the evening. The next day, Jay shares Hugh's odd behavior with her sister, but Kelly tells her not to worry. It was just their first date, and everything will be fine. The next evening, Jay and Hugh meet again, growing intimate in his car. Afterward, Jay opens up about her dreams, feeling like her life is finally coming together. But suddenly, Hugh pins her down, and despite her struggle, he knocks her out with chloroform. Jay wakes up sometime later, bound to a wheelchair in an abandoned factory. Panicked, she expects the worst, but Hugh apologizes and explains that during their intimacy, he passed something on to her, something that had been passed to him. Now, an unknown entity will relentlessly follow her. It can appear as anyone, whether a familiar face or a stranger, but no matter its form, it always hunts alone. Sometimes it can take the form of someone you love, and that's the most terrifying part. Just then, Hugh tells her it's here, grabs the wheelchair, and rushes her toward the exit. Jay spots a woman slowly walking toward them. Hugh explains that the only way to get rid of it is by passing it to another sexual partner. The entity will then leave her alone, possibly for good if she's lucky. But if she doesn't act quickly, they'll both end up dead. Afterward, he puts Jay in his car and drops her off in front of her house, where Kelly, Paul, and Yara are playing cards. They spot Jay in shock, but before they can respond, Hugh speeds off. Jay's mother calls the police, and Jay faces a barrage of uncomfortable questions. She honestly explains what happened, admitting she knows little about the guy, but can provide his address. Later, she's taken to the hospital for tests, which all come back normal, except for her shaken mental state. The following day, the police search the factory, finding Jay's belongings, but no sign of the mysterious woman or Hugh. Jay, shaken by the ordeal, struggles to cope and becomes terrified of anything out of the ordinary. Even something as simple as a ball flying through the window heightens her paranoia. Later, during a school lesson, Jay spots an old woman in a hospital gown slowly walking toward the building. Overcome with fear and confusion, she bolts from the classroom. In the hallway, Jay comes face to face with the old woman and realizes no one else can see her. Panicking, she runs to the cafe where Kelly and Paul work, frantically explaining everything and recalling Hugh's warning about passing something on to her. Her friends are unsure whether to believe Jay's bizarre story or blame it on her emotional trauma. Still, Kelly is deeply concerned, and Paul suggests they all spend the night at Jay's house. With her approval, the group stays over. Suddenly, the sound of shattering glass startles them. Paul goes to investigate and discovers the kitchen window has been broken, but no one is anywhere near the house. Jay panics and insists they call the police, but Paul talks her down, saying nothing serious happened. After calming herself, Jay heads to her room, only to stumble upon a disheveled woman urinating on the floor. The woman approaches, and Jay, terrified, locks herself in her room. Hearing her screams, Paul and Kelly plead for her to open the door. Jay lets them in, explaining what she saw, and begs them not to let anyone else in, terrified for her safety. Just then, there's a knock at the door, and they hear Yara's voice from the hallway. Paul opens it, but Jay suddenly spots a tall man standing behind her friend, unseen by the others. Jay screams and, panicked, rushes downstairs, grabs a bike, and rides off into the night. The city appears calm as she pedals through, eventually reaching a playground where she sits on the swings. The park is eerily quiet as Jay anxiously scans for the entity. Her worried friends soon find her, but Jay breaks down, knowing her mother wouldn't believe her, even if she tried to explain. Just then, a figure steps out of the darkness, and this time, everyone sees him. It's their neighbor Greg, who's worried after hearing about the attack on Jay, as they've always been friends. He suggests calling the police, but Jay asks for his help in finding Hugh instead. Greg loads everyone into his car, hoping a drive around town will help Jay calm down. Later, they visit the house Hugh had rented and find a photo of him wearing a prestigious school uniform. The next day, they visit the school, learn his real name, Jeff Redman, and get his home address. The group goes to Jeff's address, and when his mother opens the door, Jay realizes the entity at the factory had taken Mrs. Redman's form. The woman warmly invites them inside, and Jeff is forced to explain everything. Jeff explains that the entity haunts those who've been intimate with its previous victims. He confesses that his encounter with Jay was his way of escaping the curse after becoming a target from another girl. He urges Jay to pass it on, just as he did. The boy, clearly terrified, keeps insisting that if IT catches Jay, it will kill her and then come for him again. Greg remains skeptical, dismissing it as a prank, but Jay takes the story seriously. The friends express their doubts again when Jeff spots a girl approaching. He jumps up in fear, but the others also see her, giving him a brief moment of relief. Jeff reminds them that the entity moves slowly, giving them time to hide. He again urges Jay to pass it on, though admits it's not always a solution. Seeing Jay's distress, Greg suggests taking the group to his parents' lake house for safety. On the drive, Kelly urges Jay to consider Jeff's advice and pass the entity on, but Jay isn't ready for that. Later, Greg shows Jay his shed of weapons and teaches her to shoot a revolver. During the day, the group heads to the beach, and Jay feels more at ease with her friends close by. Yara swims and invites the others to join her. No one notices the entity, now in Yara's form, creeping up behind Jay. Suddenly, Kelly sees her sister's hair being lifted by an unseen force. Jay begins screaming and struggling, desperately trying to escape the invisible grip. Paul swings a chair wildly at Jay's invisible attacker, forcing it to let go. They all dash to the shed, where Jay grabs a revolver and fires at the fake Yara, but the entity remains unscathed and attacks again, smashing through the locked door. Greg arrives, hearing the gunshots, sees no one, and scolds them for the broken door, though the rest insists they saw something. Frustrated, Greg leaves, and the entity, now appearing as their neighbor boy, slips through the broken door. Jay bolts from the shed, jumps into Greg's car, and speeds away, chased by the entity in Yara's form. Her friends try to stop her, but Jay is too terrified. After driving a short distance, Jay crashes and loses consciousness. She later wakes in the hospital with a broken arm, her friends asleep in nearby chairs. Though doctors pass by her room, Jay remains gripped by fear, listening nervously to the footsteps in the hallway. That night, Greg visits Jay, still doubting the entity's existence, admitting he hasn't seen the entity despite watching for it. Paul, noticing the tension, feels jealous of Greg. Later, Jay returns home, seeking solace in her favorite pool, but her anxiety lingers. One evening, Greg visits and tells the group he hasn't seen anything, then asks if he can see Jay. They explain that Jay has locked herself in her room and won't let anyone in. Paul recalls feeling something when he swung the chair, and the door didn't break by itself, but Greg dismisses it and leaves. That night, Jay, unable to sleep, looks out the window and sees the entity, now in Greg's form, heading toward his house. Jay calls Greg, but he doesn't pick up. The entity breaks a window and enters his house. Rushing over, Jay finds it, now in Greg's mother's form, knocking on his door. Greg opens the door, and the entity kills him instantly. Jay flees, driving away and glimpsing the false Greg exiting the house in her rearview mirror. She spends the night outside, too afraid to return. The next morning, Jay spots 3 young men on a boat at the beach, undresses, and wades into the water. Later, she returns home and falls asleep in her sister's room. Paul visits, offering to take the entity from her, but Jay declines. Jay chose Greg, believing he wasn't scared. Feeling sorry for Paul, she listens as he suggests a new plan. The group decides to lure the entity into the city pool and electrocute it using appliances thrown into the water. With everything ready, they head to the pool and prepare, waiting for the entity. Jay soon enters the water and sees it take the form of her father, but instead of entering, it starts throwing unplugged electrical appliances at her. Jay struggles to escape the pool, but is hit multiple times. Paul fires in the direction Jay points, accidentally injuring Yara. Thinking fast, Kelly throws a sheet over the entity, revealing its form. Paul shoots the entity, and it falls into the water. The friends watch as Jay struggles underwater, trying to escape its grip. Paul fires again, and Jay finally surfaces, breaking free. They watch as the pool fills with blood. Afterward, Jay and Paul grow closer, while Yara recovers in the hospital. One day, Jay and Paul walk hand in hand down the street, unaware of a figure trailing behind them. The entire film feels like a lingering nightmare, a horror movie that makes you think and explores a deep societal issue. The recklessness of intimate relationships can lead to serious illness and even death. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more videos like this.